My mother's text arrived 3 days before Christmas Eve. 6 words. You're not welcome this year. I read it twice. Certain it was a mistake. Certain my phone had glitched, but the message stayed there, cold and final, sitting above a group photo from last Christmas where I was smiling next to her. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and that text was the first sign that my family had been planning something behind my back for months. I called her immediately. She didn't answer. I called my brother Tyler next. He picked up on the 4th ring, his voice careful, like he'd rehearsed this. Mom wants some space this year, he said. Space from what? I asked. He paused too long before answering. From everything. From the house situation. That word, situation, hit me strange. There was no situation. Not one anyone had told me about anyway. Here's what you need to understand before I go further. 3 years ago, my grandmother passed away and left me her house. Not my mother, not my brother, me. It was written clearly in her will, notarized, filed, uncontested at the time. She left it to me because I was the one who drove 2 hours every weekend to sit with her, to manage her medication, to listen to the same stories about my grandfather 100 times without complaint. My mother visited twice a year. My brother visited never. But when the will was read, nobody argued. Everyone smiled, hugged me, said Grandma always did love me best. It felt normal. It felt over. Except it wasn't over, because I made a decision that year that I now understand was the biggest mistake of my adult life. I let my mother and Tyler continue living in that house, rent-free. I told myself it was temporary, that Mom needed time to grieve in a familiar place, that Tyler was between jobs and just needed a few months to get back on his feet. A few months turned into 3 years. And somewhere in those 3 years, without a single conversation with me, my family started treating that house like it was theirs. They hosted holidays there. They told relatives it was the family home. They let neighbors believe my mother owned it. And every year, I still showed up as a guest in a house with my name on the deed, sleeping in my old childhood bedroom like a visitor, grateful just to be included. I didn't see the shift happening. I didn't see how normal it had become for them to treat my ownership like a technicality nobody needed to mention out loud. So when that text came through, banning me from Christmas in the house I legally owned, something in me went very quiet. Not sad. Quiet in the way a person gets right before they stop making excuses for people who hurt them. I drove to the house 2 days later. Not to fight. Not yet. I just wanted to understand what was happening to my face, in person, instead of through a screen. When I pulled into the driveway, there were already cars there. My aunt's car, my cousin's car, a wreath on the door I didn't recognize. Through the window, I could see the dining table set, decorations up, a fire going. Christmas had already started, 3 days early, and I hadn't been told. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She looked at me the way you'd look at someone who showed up somewhere they weren't invited, which in her mind, apparently, I now was. Claire, this isn't a good time, she said. It's my house, Mom, I said quietly. Her face changed instantly. That flash of irritation people get when a fact interrupts a story they've been telling for a long time. Don't start that again, she said. This is a family home. It's always been a family home. I asked her directly. Then why did Grandma leave it to me? She didn't answer that. Instead, she said something that I would replay in my head for weeks afterward. Because you were the only one desperate enough to play caretaker for a payout. I stood there in the cold, on the porch of a house I owned, being told that the years I spent caring for a dying woman were a performance for money. Behind my mother, I could see Tyler in the living room, laughing with our cousin, pretending not to notice I was standing outside. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did. I stood on those steps for what felt like a full minute, replaying every Saturday drive, every medication schedule, every night I slept on Grandma's couch so she wouldn't be alone. And I let my own mother turn all of it into an accusation. That was the moment something inside me stopped bending. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Not there. I said one sentence. You'll regret saying that. Then I got in my car and drove home. My mother probably thought that was the end of it, that I'd sulk for a few days and show up at New Year's with an apology, the way I always had before. She had no idea what I was about to do next, because that night, I didn't call her back. I didn't call Tyler. I called my lawyer. His name was Marcus Feld, and he'd handled my grandmother's estate 3 years earlier. I explained everything. The years of letting them stay. The Christmas ban. The comment on the porch. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked me one question that changed everything. Claire, do you have anything in writing that says they have permission to live there long term? I said no, there had never been a lease. Never a formal agreement. Just an unspoken understanding that had apparently, in their minds, quietly become ownership. Marcus went quiet for a moment, and then he said the words that made my stomach drop and steady at the same time. Then legally, they've been squatting in your house for 3 years, and you have every right to remove them. I sat with the phone against my ear, staring at nothing, realizing that the family who just banned me from Christmas in my own home had unknowingly handed me the exact tool I needed to take it back. 2 days before Christmas, Marcus told me he was filing the paperwork immediately, and that depending on how fast the county moved, there was a real chance the sheriff's department could be involved before the holiday even arrived. I remember asking him, almost in disbelief, "You mean they could actually show up at the house?" And he said something I will never forget. "Claire, they banned the owner from her own Christmas. Now they're going to find out exactly whose name is on that deed." I hung up the phone that night knowing something my mother didn't. While she was decorating a house she didn't own, laughing with relatives, telling everyone I wasn't welcome in the family home, a legal notice was already being prepared with her name on it. And somewhere out there, a sheriff's deputy was about to become part of our Christmas after all. The morning the paperwork was filed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sick to my stomach in a way I hadn't expected. Because underneath the anger, there was still a small part of me hoping my mother would call, apologize, and make this whole legal process unnecessary. She didn't call. Instead, she posted a photo on social media. Tyler and my cousins gathered around the Christmas tree in my grandmother's living room. Caption, "Family is everything." No mention of me. No mention that the house in the background belonged to someone she'd just banned from the property. I showed the post to Marcus during our next call. He was quiet for a moment, then said something that stuck with me. "People who take what isn't theirs always need an audience to convince them it's fine." He explained the process moving forward. Because there had never been a lease and because I was the sole legal owner, my mother and Tyler were classified as occupants without legal tenancy. That meant the standard eviction timeline didn't apply the way it would with a real tenant. Marcus filed for immediate possession, citing unauthorized occupancy, and requested law enforcement assistance for the walkthrough. Standard procedure, he said, when a property owner has reason to believe the occupants won't leave peacefully. I asked him how long it would take. He said courts moved slower during the holidays, but there was a chance, a real chance, that everything could be finalized before New Year's. I didn't tell my mother any of this. I let her keep hosting her holiday in a house that was quietly slipping out of her control with every hour that passed. 2 days later, Tyler called me. Not my mother, Tyler. His voice was different than it had been at the door, less confident. "Claire, Mom said you're being dramatic about the house thing. Can we just talk?" I asked him one question. "Did you know Grandma left the house to me because I was the only one who showed up for her?" Silence. Then he said, quietly, "I know that, Claire. I've always known that." That admission meant more to me than anything my mother had said in weeks, because it confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't confusion. This was 3 years of convenient forgetting, dressed up as family tradition. I told Tyler the truth. "There's a legal process happening right now. I own that house. I've never signed anything giving either of you permission to live there indefinitely, and I was banned from my own Christmas in it. That's not something I'm going to pretend didn't happen." He got quiet again, and then he said something that told me exactly where his loyalty had been sitting this whole time. "Mom's going to lose her mind if she finds out you're doing this. Not I'm sorry. Not that's not fair to you. Just fear of her reaction." I realized then that Tyler had spent 3 years benefiting from my patience without ever once standing up for me when it mattered. Christmas Eve arrived, and I spent it alone in my apartment, which should have felt lonelier than it did. Instead, I felt strangely calm, like I was standing at the edge of something inevitable, waiting for it to arrive rather than dreading it. Around p.m., my phone rang. It was my mother. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Claire, where are you?" Everyone's asking. Her voice was light, almost cheerful, like the porch conversation had never happened. I asked her directly, "Did you mean what you said? That I was only desperate enough to play caretaker for a payout?" There was a pause, and then, instead of apologizing, she said, "You're twisting my words. You know how stressed I've been. No apology, just a redirection." The same pattern I'd watched my whole life, just like the pattern in the story you may have seen before, where the parent turns their own cruelty into the child's overreaction. I told her plainly, "I filed paperwork 2 days ago. The house is legally mine, and you and Tyler have been living there without any agreement for 3 years. I've asked my lawyer to handle it." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she laughed, an uneasy, disbelieving laugh. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't do that to your own mother during Christmas." I said, "You didn't think twice about doing it to your own daughter." I ended the call before she could respond. Christmas Day came and went. I later learned, from my aunt, that my mother spent most of it convincing relatives that I was having some kind of breakdown, that grief over grandma had finally caught up to me, that I was acting out. Nobody in that house, apparently, wanted to ask the obvious question. If I was the one acting out, why was my name the only one on the deed? 2 days after Christmas, Marcus called me with an update that made my hands shake. The court had processed the filing faster than expected, likely because the paperwork was airtight, clear ownership, no lease, no dispute over the will, and clear documentation of the ban that proved my mother knew exactly whose property she was occupying. A hearing date had been set for December 29th, just 3 days away. If the judge ruled in my favor, and Marcus was confident law enforcement would be authorized to accompany me to the property to formally reclaim possession. I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest for days. What happens if they refuse to leave when the sheriff shows up? Marcus's answer was calm, almost clinical, but it landed like a verdict. Then it becomes a criminal matter instead of a civil one. Trespassing charges. And Claire, judges do not look kindly on grown adults who ban the legal owner from her own home and then refuse a lawful court order. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my apartment, staring at the calendar. 3 days until the hearing, and somewhere in the back of my mind, one thought kept repeating itself. My mother still had no idea a court date existed. She was still living inside a version of Christmas where she'd won, where I'd been erased quietly and without consequence, where the house would simply stay hers because it always had, in her mind if nowhere else. She had banned me from Christmas to protect an illusion. And in 3 days, that illusion was going to walk straight into a house she didn't own, escorted by a sheriff's deputy holding a court order with my name on it. The only question left was whether she'd finally understand what she'd done, or whether, even standing on the porch watching it happen, she'd still find a way to call herself the victim. December 29th arrived cold and gray, and I remember standing in my kitchen that morning unable to eat anything. Marcus had told me to meet him at the courthouse by a.m. He warned me the hearing itself would likely be short, since the documentation was so clear, but he also warned me that short didn't mean easy. Nothing about facing your own mother in front of a judge is easy, no matter how justified you are. My mother arrived with a lawyer of her own, a young man who looked like he'd taken the case the day before. Tyler sat beside her, staring at the floor, not meeting my eyes once. My mother, on the other hand, looked directly at me the entire time, like she was daring me to feel guilty. I didn't. The judge reviewed the will first, the same will that had gone uncontested 3 years earlier. Then she reviewed the absence of any lease, any rental agreement, any documented permission for long-term occupancy. My mother's lawyer tried to argue implied consent, that my allowing them to stay for 3 years created some kind of informal arrangement. The judge asked a simple question that undid the entire argument in one sentence. Did the property owner ever receive rent, or sign anything granting continued residency? The answer was no. There was nothing to argue with after that. Then Marcus introduced a text message, the one banning me from Christmas. He explained to the court that this message proved my mother understood, without question, that I held authority over that property, authority she chose to use against me rather than acknowledge. The judge read it silently, then looked up, first at the message, then at my mother. I watched something shift in the judge's expression, not anger exactly, but a kind of recognition, the look of someone who had seen this pattern before and knew exactly how it usually ended. The ruling came faster than I expected. Full legal possession restored to me effective immediately. The court authorized a supervised move out, with a sheriff's deputy present to ensure the transition happened peacefully and within the legal time frame. My mother and Tyler would have 72 hours to remove their belongings. My mother stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is my home," she said, her voice cracking, not with sadness, but with disbelief that reality wasn't bending the way it always had before. The judge simply said, "The deed says otherwise," and moved on to the next case. 3 days later, I drove to the house with Marcus and a sheriff's deputy named Officer Reyes. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel the entire way, not from fear, but from the strange, heavy weight of finally doing something I should have done years earlier. When we pulled into the driveway, my mother was standing on the porch, arms crossed, like she was still trying to control the scene the way she had every holiday before this one. Officer Reyes stepped forward first, calm and professional, and explained the court order clearly. My mother's eyes moved to me, searching for some flicker of hesitation, some sign that I'd back down the way I always had. I didn't give her one. "You did this," she said, her voice sharp. "You chose that man over your own mother." I corrected her immediately. "I chose the truth. You chose to ban me from a house I own and call me a liar to everyone we know." Tyler came out carrying a box, and for the first time in weeks, he looked at me directly. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. It wasn't much, but it was more honesty than I'd gotten from him in 3 years. My mother refused to move at first, standing in the doorway as if her presence alone could overturn a court order. Officer Reyes calmly explained that refusing to comply would escalate the matter to criminal trespassing, and that no one wanted that outcome so close to the new year. Something in her posture finally broke. Not an apology, just resignation, the look of someone who had run out of audience to perform for. It took most of the afternoon for them to load their things into a rental truck Tyler had arranged the night before. My mother didn't speak to me again while they packed. She spoke around me, to Officer Reyes, to Marcus, even to a neighbor who'd wandered over to watch, but never directly to me. I think, in her mind, acknowledging me meant acknowledging that she'd lost, and losing was something she had never learned how to do gracefully. As the truck pulled out of the driveway, she rolled down her window and said one last thing. "You'll regret this when you're alone in that big house with no family." I stood on the porch, in the cold, in front of the home my grandmother had trusted me with. And I answered her honestly. I'd rather be alone in a house that's mine than surrounded by people who only wanted it because it wasn't. She didn't respond. The truck disappeared down the street, and for the first time in 3 years, I unlocked the front door of my own house without asking anyone's permission to walk inside. The following weeks were quiet. My aunt reached out eventually, cautious, asking if we could talk. She admitted she hadn't known the full story, that my mother had described the situation very differently to everyone else, casting herself as the wronged party, casting me as someone who'd betrayed the family over property. When I explained everything calmly, with documentation, my aunt went silent for a long moment before saying, "I'm sorry we believed her so quickly. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was honest, and honesty was something my family had been missing for a very long time." I changed the locks the same week. I had the house re-inspected, repaired what needed repairing, and slowly, room by room, made it feel like mine instead of a place I visited under someone else's rules. My mother tried calling a few more times over the following months. I let most of those calls go to voicemail. The ones I did answer were short. Her testing whether guilt still worked on me confirming, gently but firmly, that it no longer did. Christmas the following year looked different. Smaller, quieter, just a few close friends who had stood by me through the entire ordeal, sitting around the same table where, 1 year earlier, I'd been erased from the guest list of my own home. There was no dramatic reconciliation, No tearful phone call from my mother admitting she was wrong. Some people never reach that point, and I've learned to stop waiting for them to. What I did learn, standing in that house I'd fought to reclaim, was this. Family isn't determined by who shares your blood or who shows up in old photographs. It's determined by who respects what's yours, who tells you the truth even when it's inconvenient, and who doesn't require your silence as the price of belonging. My mother banned me from Christmas because she believed I'd stay quiet, the way I always had. Instead, I let the truth speak for itself, and the truth walked through that door with a sheriff standing beside it. She lost more than a house that December. She lost a version of me who would always forgive without being asked to. And honestly, looking back now, I don't think I lost anything at all. I just finally stopped losing myself. All names and events in this story are fictional, created for storytelling purposes only. If this story resonated with you, remember this: the people who truly value you will never need documents, deputies, or courtrooms to prove that you belong. Sometimes walking away from what hurts you isn't losing your family. It's finally choosing yourself.